Hello everybody, this is the second of a handful of review videos I'll be creating for you. It will cover what the College Board considers to be Unit 2 material, and it's all stuff that we've pretty much covered and I think you have a good handle on. Again, you can turn the sound off and read the slides just to refresh your memory on things, or you can experience the thrill of listening to my voice, no matter how inane what I'm saying is. Either way, taking notes are encouraged since this year's test is open notes. But no matter what you do, somewhere in the last third of the video, I'm going to try to edify you culturally by showing you a clip from one of the most classic movies of all time. So stay awake for that. Let's get started. As you know, there are two main types of government systems. One is called parliamentary, in which lawmaking and executive functions are combined or fused. The national legislature selects the head of government, usually called the Prime Minister, and the Cabinet. This is often called the Westminster system because it was invented by the British, and Westminster is how they refer to their Parliament building. A presidential system that we pioneered back in the 1700s has separate elections for the legislature and the executive. And usually the executive acts as the head of government and the head of state. Usually there's fixed terms for the president, and the cabinet is responsible to the president and not the legislature. And there is a combination of the two called a semi-presidential or hybrid system. There are separate elections for the legislature and the chief executive, as in a presidential system, but there is also a prime minister who's the head of government, as opposed to the president who's the head of the state, And in the 6 countries we study, obviously the best example of a parliamentary system would be the UK. Presidential systems we would find in Mexico, Nigeria, Iran, and China. And of course, Russia is our semi-presidential system. So here's a brief comparison of parliamentary and presidential systems. Generally speaking, the biggest difference is in parliamentary systems, there are fewer institutional or formal or constitutional obstacles to enacting policy. In other words, there's just not that much stopping the majority party from getting things done because as long as the majority party sticks together, there's no such thing as divided government like there is in the U.S. system. There's also no term limits on prime ministers. They can be reelected indefinitely. Checks and balances do exist. No confidence votes are possible. Question time is a tradition in the UK that holds the Prime Minister and Cabinet Ministers accountable. And from time to time, if the majority party is divided amongst itself, as we saw in 2017, 2018, and 2019 over the issue of Brexit and the Conservative Party, sometimes there can be an issue with a prime minister getting his own party to cooperate and pass legislation in Parliament. It's rare, but it can happen. So, what to remember about each country's chief executive? As we go through the next few slides, I strongly recommend maybe jotting a few things down in terms of a graphic organizer so you can quickly organize the important details about each country's chief executive, and so you don't have to spend time remembering or recalling facts during the test itself. When it comes to China, the key facts about the president is that whereas there used to be a term of 5 years and a 2-term limit, the current president, Xi Jinping, has had those limits on his power abolished. The president is the commander-in-chief. He's also the general secretary, and this is where his power really comes from, because he's not elected president in a sense that we Westerners would recognize. The president gets most of his power from being general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. How those decisions are made, who moves up, who has power, who does this, all those decisions are made out of the public view, behind closed doors. In other words, there is no such thing as transparency when it comes to the Chinese government. When it comes to Iran, it's important to remember that they have what's called a dual executive, kind of like in the case of Russia. Only in Iran, only one of those two executives is elected. That would be the president. He is directly popularly elected, 4-year term, 2-term limits. and does the standard kind of stuff that presidents do in countries, oversees the cabinet and bureaucracy, conducts foreign policy. There's also in Iran the supreme leader, who's appointed by an assembly of experts based on his religious credentials. And it doesn't say this in the Constitution, but the supreme leader, or the faqih, so far they've served for life. The first one died in office, and the current one, well, he's kind of making rumblings about maybe wanting to retire, but that's just all kind of rumors and hearsay at this point, and nothing factual that I can report to you. The supreme leader is the commander-in-chief, not the president. And in Iran, you have to remember that not only is there a regular Iranian army that he's the commander-in-chief of, but he has his own private army called the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which the United States has branded as a terrorist organization, and which Iran uses to, well, from our point of view, stir up trouble all over the place in the Middle East. The Supreme Leader has a long list of powers that has been presented to you elsewhere. He also appoints the Expediency Council and half of the Guardian Council and the head of the judiciary. Way more power in the hands of the Supreme Leader, according to the principle of Velayat el-Faqih, or the jurist guardianships. The principle of jurist guardianship, which is to make sure that a religious elite remains all-powerful and can make sure all laws and practices in the country conform to their version of Islam. In Mexico, we see a very standard, at least from the U.S. point of view, listing of the president's powers. Mexican presidents have a 6-year term with a 1-term limit. They cannot be reelected. They are the head of state and the head of government, commander-in-chief, approving legislation with veto power. They conduct foreign policy and oversee the cabinet and bureaucracy. Pretty standard stuff from our point of view. Nigeria's information is also very familiar to us Americans. There is a president, 4-year term, 2-term limit. He's the head of state and of government, commander-in-chief. His duties included approving legislation with a veto power. Also, he conducts foreign policy and, as we just saw with Mexico, oversees the cabinet and bureaucracy. Pretty standard stuff. And then Russia, we once again enter the land of the highly unusual. The president has a 6-year term, 2-term limit, but and that would be accurate for any test you'll take in the near future. But President Putin has announced a plan to change all that. The details are not really worth talking about at this moment because they haven't been passed yet, but they will. But at some point, things will get changed. And he'll just stay president for as long as he wants to be. He's the head of state as the president. He's the commander-in-chief. He conducts foreign policy, and he appoints the prime minister and the Federation Council, which, as you will see in some upcoming slides, is the upper house of the national legislature. There's also a prime minister who's appointed by the president, approved by the Duma, which is the lower house of the legislature. The prime minister is the head of government, which means he oversees the cabinet ministers and the bureaucracy directly, while the president goes off and makes trouble around the world. Not officially, but that's kind of the way it works. And finally, the UK, again, we have what is technically a dual executive situation, although the powers of the monarch are so small at this point, it's very rarely described that way. All the action is with the prime minister, who is elected to parliament, just like any other member of parliament, but then by virtue of being the leader of the majority party, is appointed as prime minister, or sometimes by a coalition of parties that hold the majority of seats in the parliament. The UK prime minister is known as the head of government. He's the chief executive, runs the cabinet and the bureaucracy, conducts foreign policy, is the de facto commander-in-chief, and has the power to call new parliamentary elections. The monarch is the head of state, but very, very few formal powers, can approve laws and do some other things that are mostly ceremonial, but really most of the power is with the prime minister. And I forgot to mention, there are no term limits on the prime minister. As long as that person can get reelected into parliament and be chosen by the majority party to be prime minister, there's no limit on how many times or how often or how long that can be. I mentioned term limits with respect to, I think, all of the chief executives that we've studied. There are advantages and disadvantages you might have to discuss on a AP exam. So let's just kind of remind ourselves that the good thing about having term limits on the executive is that it can get in the way. It can inhibit a president kind of carrying things a little too far and somehow emerging as a dictator at some point. In theory, what a term limit does is makes the office holder focus more on his or her job rather than the next election. I said in theory because it can work the other way too. Another tangible advantage of term limits is that there has to be turnover in office. There has to be someone new elected every once in a while, and that can provide opportunities for new leaders, new ideas, fresh blood, blah, blah, blah. Disadvantages is, well, what if somebody's doing a really good job and a term limit forces that person from the office? That could be a disadvantage. In the modern world, it takes a long time for policy to not only just get enacted, but to become implemented and to see if it's working or not. For example, in our country, Obamacare was passed in 2010. It had only been functioning for a few years by the time he left office in 2018. We're still arguing over it. You could argue that if he'd had more time in office, he could have spent more time making sure it was working properly and so forth. Any major reform or policy effort does take time, and if a term and term limits can combine to make it difficult for anybody to get anything done in that compressed time frame. It also weakens accountability in the sense that if a president can't be reelected because of term limits, you could argue he has little incentive to do his job or do it legally or do it well. That lame duck period, we talk about it in this country too, means that there's a period of time where the president just isn't taken seriously because everyone knows he's about to leave office. Well, that's guaranteed when you have term limits. And that can be obviously a disadvantage for any chief executive. When it comes to removing the executive, most countries have a mechanism for doing that. In this case, we're going to start with the exception. In Mexico, there is no formal impeachment mechanism for a Mexican president. The current president, AMLO, has proposed a constitutional amendment that would allow for a recall election. But it has not actually been formally approved as of yet. Interestingly, he's also floated this idea of having a kind of a national public opinion poll on whether or not he's doing a good job about halfway through his term of 6 years. That might sound like a magnanimous thing for him to do. What some people suspect is that he'll probably get a favorable rating from the people of Mexico, and then some people fear that he will use that to maybe do things in his last 3 years in office that might not be so great. But we'll have to see how that all plays out. In Nigeria, there is, as there is in the United States, a formal method for impeaching and removing a president. It's more complicated than what I've put on this slide. The U.S. method is actually relatively simple compared to what the Nigerian Constitution lays out. But basically, 2/3 of both houses of their National Assembly are involved in various steps. And basically, you don't have to know the details other than it can happen. In Iran, and in Russia, these are two of our dual executive systems. When it comes to the supreme leader, the Assembly of Experts, in theory, has the power to remove the supreme leader. It's never happened and probably never will. The president can be removed by the supreme leader with the approval of the Majlis, kind of similar to an impeachment process that we might be familiar with. That's never happened either. In Russia, the prime minister can be dismissed by the president at any time, and that just happened in Russia. Prime Minister Medvedev was dismissed by President Putin back in, I want to say, December or January. And the president himself can be impeached, but that would take 2/3 of the Duma, which is controlled currently by Putin's party, and he would be ultimately removed by the Federation Council. A 2/3 vote there is required, which is also highly unlikely because the President Putin appointed everybody in the Federation Council. So it can happen in theory, but won't be happening in Russia anytime soon. In the UK, which as we've seen is a parliamentary system, a prime minister can be removed by a vote of his or her own party and replaced by another individual from the same party. There can also be a change in prime ministers through an election that might be triggered by a no confidence vote. It's been a while since that's happened, but it is a theoretical possibility. And then finally, when we turn to China, which is a one-party presidential system, no Chinese president has ever been removed from office before the end of his term, and as we know, there are no longer any terms. But just looking at the history of Communist Party states, I can only think of one example where any communist leader was removed from office before dying in office. That would be Khrushchev back in the early 1960s in the Soviet Union. Anyway, that has nothing to do with us, but it's just kind of a little background that tells you that it is highly unlikely that any Chinese president will ever be removed from office before the end of their term. Since they're not elected, we don't really know how they get selected in the first place or who they're keeping happy to keep their job. I mentioned the word transparency earlier in this video. Transparency is just simply a concept that does not apply to China. The opposite of transparency is opaque. The decision-making process in China is very opaque, so we have no idea how things are done, how decisions are made, and it'd be a complete shock to everybody if anybody like Xi Jinping was ever removed before he wanted to be removed. Turning to legislatures, let's handle the unicameral systems first. And in China, of course, it's unicameral because it's completely powerless and useless, so why bother dividing it into two? It's ironically described by the Constitution in China that the National People's Congress is the most powerful government body, but in reality, it's the weakest. It only meets 2 weeks a year, and its whole purpose during that meeting is to rubber stamp. That means pretty much automatically approve everything that is submitted to it as legislation. Those decisions are made by the Politburo and the Standing Committee of the Politburo, which are the two most actual powerful bodies, although technically they're not government bodies. Those are structures within the Chinese Communist Party. Each of these slides is going to discuss the concept of independence from the executive, because the more independent the other branches are from the executive, the more chances you have of actual democracy. The less independent the legislatures and the judicial branches are from the executive branches, then the more possibility you have an authoritarian type regime. And in China, the concept of being independent from the executive branch is not even a relevant concept to discuss. In Iran, we have the other technically unicameral legislature. It's called the Majlis. It is formally unicameral. It is hemmed in, and its power is restricted from a variety of angles. The laws can be vetoed by the president. Their laws can be vetoed by the supreme leader. Laws can be vetoed by the Guardian Council. Because the Guardian Council is a body of people and not just a person, and the fact that it can get in the way of legislation. Some sources might consider it to be a de facto upper house of the legislature, but the Majlis is technically unicameral. When you're talking about independence from the executive, you have to consider the fact that there are two executives in Iran. The power relationship and the interactions between the Majlis and the president in Iran are similar to that of many other countries, but there is a supreme leader, and again, that Guardian Council, that their whole reason for being there is to enforce what's called juris guardianship. So the fact that the supreme leader and the Guardian Council can vet judicial legislative candidates and veto laws to make sure they conform to Islam. Makes the judgment of whether the legislature is independent of the executive. Technically, yes, but it's under such harsh control. It's hard to make much of that. Turning to bicameral legislatures. First, we'll consider Mexico, which is also a federal system. So the structure of the legislature is going to be very similar to the United States. Formally, its name is the Congress of the Union. The lower house is called the Chamber of Deputies, and it does normal things like representing the people directly, approving laws, levying taxes. The upper house, as in the United States, is called the Senate. It is there to represent the states. It has a more complicated representational scheme, but it's mostly there to represent the interests of each of the 32 states. I believe if you do the math, you end up with a total of 128 senators, but you don't have to know that unless you enjoy doing math. Independent from the executive, formally yes. It is elected separately. It has separate constitutional powers, but like any such system, the question of party control is always there, and if the same party controls the legislature and the executive branch, and you have what's called unified government, then that does kind of eat into the possibility of separation of powers and checks and balances. But on paper, those concepts do apply, and we can consider the Mexican legislature to be independent of the executive. And in Nigeria, another federal system, and another bicameral legislative system, very similar to the United States. The legislature is called the National Assembly. It has a lower house called the House of Representatives, which directly represents the people and does all the normal kind of legislative things you would expect from a lower house. And there's an upper house called the Senate, representing the states again. There are 3 senators from each state, plus 1 for the capital city of Abuja, which I probably just mispronounced. And again, as we saw in Mexico, they are the executive and the legislature are formally independent of one another. There is, on paper, in the Constitution, the idea of separation of powers and checks and balances. But again, because of the use of political parties, there is the possibility of unified government in which that those ideas are diluted somewhat at times. Turning to Russia, another bicameral legislature and another federal system, but very different from the United States. In Russia, we have the Federal Assembly. The lower house is called the State Duma. It directly represents the people, as in the U.S., but because there's the dual executive there, the hybrid presidential parliamentary system, there is a prime minister that the Duma confirms. The Duma also passes laws. There's an upper house called the Federation Council. It is not elected. It is meant to represent the states, but under the current scheme, basically it represents the president because everybody in the Federal Council is appointed by the president. Is the legislature independent of the executive? Constitutionally, on paper, that is supposed to be the case. However, in Putin's Russia, his party controls the Duma because the elections there are so rigged and managed. His party always wins a vast majority of the seats in the lower house. He appoints everybody in the upper house, so it's hard to consider the legislature independent of the executive in Russia. And finally, in the UK, we have a bicameral system, but it is a unitary style government. So you're going to have some differences with the US. The UK legislature is called Parliament, of course. The lower house is the House of Commons. It is directly elected by the people. It selects the Prime Minister, who's the most powerful figure in British politics. And Parliament and the House of Commons within Parliament wields virtually all the political power in the United Kingdom. The upper house, called the House of Lords, is a shadow of its former self. It was noticed by the names, House of Commons, House of Lords. The upper house does not represent regions of the country. It's supposed to represent the nobility, the class of people in the UK, although that's kind of a bygone notion these days. It is 100% appointed. They are not elected, and its powers have been limited to reviewing and amending and possibly even delaying legislation, but it can't really suggest legislation or do much more than just kind of give its opinions once in a while. Independent from the executive, not even on paper. Even if they had a constitution, it would not even hint at any sort of independence between the legislature and the executive, because the executive, as we've seen, comes from the legislature. There's no such thing as separation of powers. The only thing that can stop the majority party is disagreements within the majority party. Let's turn to judicial systems, where I will try to comment on, again, the concept of independence, or in this case, judicial independence from the executive, notions of rule of law, the concept of judicial review. I'll try to give you an idea of how pertinent those ideas are to each of the 6 countries we study. Let's start with the country with probably the least judicial independence. That's China. Like everything else, everything is under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. All judicial appointments are controlled by the Communist Party. And even though the concept of civil liberties and due process rights are mentioned in the Chinese Constitution, they do not exist in real life. And so, surprise, surprise, I'm shocked, I tell you, to report to you that the conviction rate in China is over 99%. The phrase I just used, shocked, is a reference to a film that probably none of you have seen, but if you haven't, you're about to see a clip from a classic movie called Casablanca. Pretty much anybody my age or older is pretty familiar with this movie and will recognize some of the classic lines from it. The clip you're about to see is one of the more humorous moments. Hope you enjoy it. So that was somewhere in the middle of the movie. Just a quick synopsis. Claude Rains, who's the French gendarme in that clip, has generally a mostly friendly relationship with Humphrey Bogart's character, he's the American named Rick, who owns the cafe. But since it's in the middle of World War II and Morocco is occupied by the Germans, every once in a while, Claude Rains' French police character has to pretend to enforce the laws. And in this occasion, he was choosing to close down Rick's establishment because he was shocked to find that gambling was occurring, and at that very moment somebody brings up the money he just won by gambling. It's pretty funny. You should see the whole movie. It's a great thing to do. Great little cultural touchstone for American culture. Back to China and its legal system, kind of on the dark side here. China, by most measures, executes. It gives the death penalty for a lot of crimes that might be serious, but in most of the rest of the world do not warrant the death penalty. And China executes more convicts than the rest of the world combined. Rule of law does not exist in China. They have something called rule by law, which all that means is that there are laws and people obey them. The laws exist to keep the regime in power. Rule of law has a more democratic overtones to it, and we'll talk about that later. Judicial review does not exist. The wishes of the Communist Party are always carried out. The judicial branch never gets in the way. In Iran, the judicial system exists as part of the juris guardianship concept to make sure that any statutes that come from the legislature are in conformance with what's called Sharia, or Islamic religious law. All judges are trained in Sharia. Judges are all powerful in their courtrooms. The Supreme Leader appoints the chief judge, who has pretty much control over all the other judicial appointments. So with respect to the Supreme Leader, there's no such thing as judicial independence. concepts that we are used to, like due process, jury trials, the concept of appealing, those ideas barely exist in Iran. Iran imposes punishments that are considered very brutal by a lot of other countries. And while China executes more people overall, the current estimate is that Iran executes more people per capita. And of course, judicial review does not exist in any sense that we would recognize. In Mexico, we have a judicial system that is a little more recognizable to us. It is constitutionally separate in Mexico, so judicial independence is a fact in Mexico, especially since the 2000 election, when the PRI stranglehold on power was finally broken. The Mexican Supreme Court does have the power of judicial review in the American sense. There have been some reforms instituted in the last 12 years or so that have tried to increase the due process rights and the transparency of the court system, reduce the corruption that used to be so prevalent. Some of those reforms have worked, but what's happened then is that criminals have taken advantage of the system and the crime rate has soared, and now there are some proposals being circulated that would undo a lot of those reforms. So the judicial system in Mexico is a little bit in transition. What we call the rule of law is a serious problem in Mexico. Just ask the drug lords, the intimidated judges, the corrupt police. The list is endless. Like we've discussed in class, Mexico has a very serious rule of law problem. Likewise, in Nigeria, very similar to Mexico, constitutionally, the judicial branch is separate. In Nigeria, Supreme Court judges are recommended by a judicial council, then they're formally appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate. They have very lengthy terms, not life terms like in the United States, but very lengthy terms. It does have, on paper, the power of judicial review, along the lines of the American system. Unfortunately, the judicial system in Nigeria is widely understood to be plagued by standard corruption, and then just endless delays. Even if cases are brought that deserve to be brought, they seem to take months and months and years, and the overall judicial system is not seen as very effective. Rule of law is a problem. It's a reflection of the corruption that's endemic in Nigerian society. And it has to be mentioned here that in the northern part of the country, in predominantly Muslim states, in the northern part of Nigeria, Sharia is the legal system, pretty much separate from the rest of the legal system found in Nigeria. And in Russia, the Russian Constitution does mention judicial review. It does lay out a theoretically separate judicial branch, but judges are nominated by the president and confirmed by the upper house of the legislative branch, called the Federation Council, which is also appointed by the president. The president is Vladimir Putin, and therefore judicial independence simply does not exist in Russia. In reality, the Russian judicial system has been used by Putin to target his enemies, to target his opponents. Anybody who dares to raise their voice or hand against Putin and his establishment of power has pretty much gone the way of Khodorkovsky, or worse. Khodorkovsky was, as you recall, was once the richest man in Russia, owned the main oil company. He ran afoul of Putin, and Putin just had him put in jail, had his company taken away from him, and he eventually now lives in exile in the UK or Switzerland or somewhere. Anyway, the judicial system is completely under the thumb of the president, and it is not an effective check on the executive branch's power. Russia is a thoroughly corrupt country, and that corruption invades the judicial branch also. So the concept of rule of law is not very meaningful in Russia either. And finally, the UK. The English judicial system has the longest history, goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. So they've been working on ideas that are familiar to us in this country. Just things like things like rule of law, civil liberties, stare decisis, common law. Those are important concepts in our legal system that we borrowed from theirs. However, their Supreme Court was only created just a few years ago in 2009. Up until that, the House of Lords functioned as the country's highest court, but that power was taken away from the House of Lords in a series of reforms. And so now there is a separate Supreme Court. Now, the idea of judicial review is not an important concept in the UK because, in theory, Parliament has all the power. But let's give it time. The Supreme Court has once or twice made some surprising rulings bossing Parliament around, and that might kind of become a pattern sometime in the future. Parliament is also there to resolve disputes between Parliament and the lower devolved bodies like the Welsh Assembly and the Scottish Parliament, because now that they have their own powers, there might be legal conflicts between what different legislatures decide. So you need a Supreme Court to resolve those disputes. Also, as long as the UK is part of the EU, it won't be for much longer, but as long as it is, there can be conflicts between British law and European law that the British Supreme Court would have to decide between. It's kind of ironic that out of all the countries we study in the course, it's the one without a constitution that is the most effective at protecting civil liberties and that precious thing called rule of law. It kind of makes sense, though. They invented it, so good for them. Just a quick comment on judicial independence itself. We use that phrase to refer to the degree of the judiciary's independence from other branches. And it kind of depends on just how much authority the courts are given to do certain things, like overrule the executive and legislative actions if they have that power. That's called judicial review. If they have that power, then that increases the notion of judicial independence. The process by which judicial officials require their jobs and the length of their terms. What are the expected or required professional and academic backgrounds of judicial officials? Is there a process for removing judges from their posts? These are all factors that affect judicial independence. And the reason we focus on it is because judicial independence is it's a good way to measure the strength of a democracy, or the weakness of a democracy, or the strength of an authoritarian system. An independent judicial branch can be part of a healthy system of checks and balances. It can be crucial in the protection of civil rights and liberties. The rule of law depends on an independent judicial branch and separation of powers. All these things help make a country more democratic and less authoritarian, and a crucial role is played by the independence of the judicial system. Usually we're afraid of it's the executive branch that we're concerned about, so independence of the judicial branch from the executive. I won't bore you by reading this slide, but just to squeeze in one more pitch for the rule of law. These aspects of the rule of law are really important. If you find them present in a country, then you can advocate for the presence of rule of law. It's probably an indicator of democratization. People should be governed by the law and not arbitrary decisions made by individuals. The people who run the country, the powerful individuals, the government officials, they are just as much subject to the law as a regular person. The laws are clearly publicly stated. People are aware of them. People know about them. People obey them. They contain protections for fundamental rights. The way laws become laws generally involve some sort of democratic participation by the people themselves. And justice, or the legal system, acts in a relatively, in a reasonably quick fashion. That cases don't drag on for years. People aren't held arbitrarily for no reason. the judicial system is given the resources it needs to rule quickly and fairly. Those are all aspects of the rule of law that in the 6 countries we study, let's be honest, yeah, well, we'll find out in the next slide. How about that? In a recent measuring of the rule of law globally by the World Justice Project, our 6 countries, most of them don't do so well. The UK ranks the highest, and then the US, which is not part of the course, of course, but just for comparison purposes, we rank just a little bit below the UK on those factors that we just discussed about what constitutes rule of law. And then the other 5 that we study all come in way, way, way down the list out of all the countries in the world. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you took some notes. The whole idea is get ready for the AP exam. Email me if you have any questions. Bye-bye.